It's time for Gouache quick tip on how to save your paint. You start a painting and it is looking great, but then you take a break because we all need breaks. However, you come back and that wonderful moist gouache is now dry and hard and it's flaking and it's a nightmare. You gotta get rid of all that paint because reactivating gouache after it's dried, it's just not the same, and those paints are expensive. So what are we going to do? We're going to find a container or maybe get something like an airtight palette. But meanwhile, you can use something like a tin. There are wonderful candy tins, or a plastic sealable container. Something that if you walk away, you can close that lid and the moisture in there is going to keep that paint viable. Because as a water-based paint, water is gouache's best friend. And its enemy sometimes. But we're not going to really talk about that. Instead, we're going to talk about how to save your paint easily and at home. Like with this container. This old candy tin I've used for years. You use it in 2 different ways, actually more. But this way, you would use a damp rag or paper towel and leave your paint on top of that. And then use the other side of your tin as your mixing palette. If you close the lid, your paint should stay viable with the moist rag. Now, this is the way I typically used my tin. I still have the moist rag or paper towel, but I lay it out underneath, put parchment paper on top, and on top of that parchment paper, I would have my paints. The rag you should keep slightly moist. You don't want it heavily saturated because then it'll just be messy. But if you close the tin and you come back later and open it, your paint will still be moist. Now I'm going to talk about something that I'm actually new to, airtight palettes, which were an amazing find, personally for me. This little guy I bought online, did some research, and I do still use a tin palette for some mixing or a little separate palette, and then I'll use a little spray bottle to occasionally mist my paint outside of this palette. But in terms of palette, like the main paint, instead of squeezing some from my tube, I don't have to anymore. I keep it in here, and I've had this for a few weeks, and I check it almost daily, and I can tell you my paint is as moist as when I squeeze it out of the tube. Now, 2 out of the 3 rows I have gouache, and my 3rd row I have watercolor. I do have an empty slot, which I will add another color in eventually. It's got a great seal, as you see me showing it here. I was really impressed with that. One thing, though, I have to say with these airtight palettes is that, when you're putting your paint in, you don't think about this, but mold. Mold becomes kind of an element because even though they're airtight, when you open it, you're exposing it. And maybe on your brush, there could have been an element. So when you seal your container, there's potential for mold. I did have the case on my black, my M grams black, my ivory black. I noticed a little spore developing. I scraped it out and put new paint in, but I was pretty afraid that my paints were all compromised. Because, see, I didn't want to go back to having something like this with my dry paint. I wanted to be able to use my airtight palette and not have a whole thing of wasted paint. Turns out rubbing alcohol, you add a drop or 2 to the paint, so I put it in my black inkwell, and I've checked my paint since then, have not developed any mold in that slot. Thank God. I did find out that possibility of why mold developed could have been in the paint composition itself, that the M grams had a lower fungicide ratio. Anyway, it's all good things to learn in the great journey of art, but I like this palette because it's, besides being able to use it in the studio, it can also be used, with traveling and plein air painting. It's got a neat little scraper. But the main point of this is to understand that something like this or a tin are very important and essential for gouache painting. I wouldn't really recommend just whipping out gouache and painting without having a plan of how to save your paint or maintain your paint. Using things like this in tandem, it really makes a difference in the workflow and the viability, and I recommend you trying it.